Baldur's Gate 3 released in August of 2023. If you're remotely interested in video games and haven't been in a coma for the past few months, chances are you might have heard that it's, pretty good.
And the game of the year is Baldur's Gate 3.
Even better, it sounds absolutely fantastic as well. When first playing it, I briefly thought about making a video on its sound design, but dismissed the idea. Surely, other people would give the game's audio the praise and attention it deserves, right? Well, now it's months later and, when looking around, I find the lack of material on the game's sound design almost disturbing. I guess everybody is still busy enjoying it, because that's the only explanation that makes sense to me. In any way, after my best friend and I had so much fun with the game, I couldn't fight off the desire to talk about its audio and tackle this issue. So here we go. Overall, I expect this to turn out more as an appreciation post for the game's audio in video form, but as always, I hope to give both sound designers and players that are just interested in the topic something to think about. Oh, and by the way, there will be some mild spoilers, you have been warned. Let's start with something that might be a bit of a stretch for some. Everything around dialogues. Not all aspects I'm gonna touch will be sound design, but I feel that everything revolving around the spoken word simply is too big of a deal for the overall soundscape of the game, not to mention it. Baldur's Gate 3 has over 180,000 lines of dialogue. 180,000! Let that sink in. Each line had to be written, proofread, iterated upon, recorded, cut, processed, as well as stored and implemented in a manner that made sense for the tools Larian had at hand. Not to mention the fact that many of those lines very likely had more than just one take, some were accompanied by motion capture performances, and many more lines never actually made it into the final game. Now, I'm more than sure that the underlying dialogue system of the game is amazing, but that's not quite my domain. Rather, I'd like to go over two things when it comes to dialogue: data storage and management, as well as voice processing. I know. Data storage and management might not sound very exciting at the first glance, but it's an important part of any project and only becomes more important the larger the game gets. The topic is extremely exhaustive, but I'll try to only get the main point across. So, let's say our lines have already been written, recorded, and processed. All we need to do now is to save the processed files with a name and in a location that makes sense. Easy, right? And this is where the fun starts. Baldur's Gate 3 is not exactly a linear game. Just putting all dialogue files into one folder and naming them chronologically with increasing numbers doesn't seem like a suitable option. So, let's bring some order into the chaos. How about we sort the dialogues after the location they appear in? That sounds feasible, right? So, we could first create a folder for each location, then a folder for each specific dialogue. We could then go chronologically and… wait, there's usually different dialogue options. So, how about we create another folder for each dialogue branch? Sure, that would work, but we must keep in mind that dialogues can go from one branch to another, further branch. Oh boy. And now the first level of our sorting is the dialogue location. But many dialogues can actually be held in many different locations. Granted, there are tools and middleware-specific functionality that allow the sorting of files through tags. This might give some flexibility when implementing the files into the game later, but they still need to be stored somewhere. Additionally, we must now also assign and maintain these tags for every file. I hope I got the point across. Storing and managing dialogue data is a very important, very huge task on its own. Failing in doing it properly can and will result in massive amounts of time wasted because people take ages to find the files they're looking for. It's also an area in which large projects specifically can benefit tremendously from smart and efficient automation. If you expect me to give an answer on how to do the perfect sorting, sorry, I can't. I think it really boils down to the requirements of a project and the tools at hand. Alright, enough data stuff. Let's dig a bit into the sonic aspects of the dialogues. Overall, voice processing is one of the highlights for me. Funny enough, in retrospective, I especially appreciate how often Larian chose not to do any crazy processing. For example, at one point, you get to interrupt two lovebirds in the process of doing lovebird things. It just so happens that one of the lovebirds is an ogre lady. And this is what she sounds like.
Passion squished like slow goats underfoot. We leave.
There's no heavy processing here. No heavy pitch shifting, no crazy multiband compression. Larian obviously did an incredible job with their voice actor casting, which allowed them to make the actors do a lot of the heavy lifting rather than relying on lots of artificial effects. Whether this was done deliberately or not, I think it's worth pointing out that this also seems to be a great strategic decision. Creating just any monster sound is not that much of a biggie. But as soon as a monster speaks, it needs to stay understandable, which limits the options for processing quite a bit. The more often you are able to stay clear of crazy effects on the voices, the more unique the ones that you do treat will sound. And dare I say, Larian did a fantastic job with their treatment. Putting the processed dialogue side by side for this video made me realize even more how well they were able to craft unique sonic identities for their characters. Let's quickly go over some of them, starting with Lump the Enlightened, an ogre from Act 1.
Brothers, look here. I have eyed yet another prize. Fortune favors our bellies. Stranger, be you friend or food. The mark is her measure. Show us the brand of the absolute.
The first thing I noticed is something I briefly mentioned before. The voice casting and acting itself is absolutely outstanding and delivers something no processing chain could rectify. This really is true for all dialogues in the game, but I'm not gonna repeat it for each character. Anyway, back to the processing. In Lump's case, there is not much pompous special effects. The focus was clearly on tastefully using pitch and dynamics processing to sell his size and character.
Indeed. How regrettable that your meat must go unsavored.
And they did a really great job. The low end has a nice belly around the 130 Hz area, while cutting the sub-bass area. This creates a deep and imposing, but at the same time very warm character.
We follow the sense of blood and gold to all lands fertile, friend.
It also leaves room for Lump's very rumbly footsteps that are audible during the dialogue.
Gluttony and greed.
Next up is our friendly neighborhood Driderman Karnis, and I absolutely love what Larian did here.
And you, what are you?
In their great interview with a sound effect, the Larian sound guys mentioned that they oftentimes tried to keep a somewhat dry, meaning not too much affected, version of the voice in the center while playing around with effects in the left and right channels. When closely listening to Karnis' dialogue, you can hear that his voice, or at least parts of the upper frequency spectrum, subtly move around between the left and right channel.
Yes, they'll do nicely.
The Larian guys mentioned using a 3-band panner, meaning they're able to pan different areas of the frequency spectrum to different channels, and I'm quite sure this is at play here.
Wily, if you stray from the light even for a moment, they'll have you.
He is not exactly a stable fellow, and I think this is a nice way of creating some uneasiness without excessive use of voice-altering effects. The really cool part, however, is the expression-based layering. Karnis' dialogue constantly has some subtle, insect-like noises woven in.
You have more worshippers every day, Majesty. Yes, we shall go. Your light leads the way, my queen.
Whenever he raises his voice, this insect layer also raises in volume and character, fittingly sounding more agitated. Additionally, another low-pitched voice layer is also introduced in these situations.
To insult me is to insult Her Majesty. It is to mock the Absolute.
Closer. We
Cannot wait long.
I personally just love this. Karnis' character is defined by sudden mood swings that may or may not result in someone being torn to shreds. Emphasizing these outbursts by making him sound more animal-like and demonic adds so much to his overall appearance in the game and is a textbook example of how great sound design can help in shaping a character.
time, Majesty, but not long. The shadows are getting closer.
Last but not least, let's have a look and listen at Mind Flayers, and the Emperor in particular.
Trying to guard us. The brain is restless, but I am distracted.
Mind Flayers communicate telepathically, basically beaming their speech and thoughts into the brains of other beings. So the task at hand for Larian was to create a voice that's kinda in your head. And I think they did a really nice job. The characterization heavily relies on reverb and delay effects. The delay is interesting. There is a somewhat subtle delay in the center of the stereo image, with a quite long pre-delay. However, there also seem to be some hard left and right pan delays that peak seemingly at random. At least I couldn't really detect a clear pattern.
I can think of nothing. No one else. What I had with Belen Stelmane was much more than that. It was unique.
And then there's the reverb. Most noteworthy to me is how well it is mixed together with the overall voice. It really shows how much care Larian put into it. We humans heavily rely on reverb to determine distances when hearing something. The usage of heavy, direct reverb can make something sound further away, which is not always desirable. And yes, I'm heavily resisting the urge right now to dig into this deeper. Anyway, the Emperor's voice processing uses a healthy amount of reverb, but the careful mixing with its emphasis on the higher end of the frequency spectrum allows it to maintain a strong sense of closeness and presence.
You thought you were my first ally. Far from it. I have long sought the allyship of others. It is the only way to succeed.
There's also something else about the Emperor's voice that I can't quite grasp. I feel that its voice is very raspy in a fascinating way, but I'm really not sure if it's not quote-unquote just the voice actor. Either way, it sounds brilliant.
I need to focus. The brain is rebelling again. Be on your way and leave me to my thoughts.
There's so much more to say about the game's dialogues and voice processing, but that'll have to be it for now. Let's move on to the sound design. I was pondering quite a bit on how to do this part. Initially, I wanted to pick some sounds from a few different categories and analyze them. But given the amount of sonic content the game has to offer, this would have felt way too random. Then I dug into the A sound effect interview again and realized that we were given something quite rare. Larian's audio director, Stefan Randelshofer, mentioned the keywords that he and the team designed the game's soundscape around. I really love this. Sounds can be a very subjective matter, and so can be sound design. Working on a massive project such as Baldur's Gate 3 requires quite a few people, and all these people must deliver work that sounds as coherent as possible in the final product. I'm certain that ensuring consistency for the game's audio was a much more elaborate affair than just putting a few keywords onto the table. But knowing these keywords when listening to the game can allow us to see patterns, draw parallels, and better understand why things sound the way they do, other than just for the sake of sounding nice. Anyway, the keywords are impactful, juicy, rich, and rewarding. I chuckled a bit when I first read this, because at first glance, this seems to be sound design buzzword bingo. But when putting these keywords next to the actual sound design of the game, yeah, definitely. That checks out. The game is full of transients and thunderous sounds with long fade-outs that linger in the mix.
I will take the artifact for my queen!
I think there are two extremes when approaching a sound direction. In the one extreme, you try to make something as realistic as possible, come as close to the real thing as you can, and then make it larger than life with processing. If you have to design something that doesn't exist in the real world, then you can try to approximate it with pseudo-physical rules and the visuals of whatever you're trying to voice. There has to be some sense or explanation. The other extreme is it to throw all of that out of the window and focus almost entirely on creating sounds that simply feel right, no matter if there is any reasonable explanation. I definitely feel that Baldur's Gate 3 leans very heavily towards the latter. And it makes sense. None of the keywords is realistic or authentic. Here's an example. When I think about designing the sound for missing an opponent with a sword, the first thing that comes to my mind is the classic airy swoosh, maybe paired with a resonant slicing layer to give the sound a bit more character. Let's have a listen at the sound in Baldur's Gate 3. Now that's some heavy stuff. It's not something I'd expect as a listener at first. But even though it's a miss, it's still extremely rich, and I wouldn't want a more modest sound in its place. I also think it still works so well because of the rest of the game's sound design. So many elements use punchy transients that the miss sound, which lacks a clear and impactful transient, still evokes the feeling of, well, missing something. Sticking with the example, here's the miss again, but this time followed up with 2 actual hits. Interesting enough, the hits fundamentally have a very similar character to the miss. The largest difference are the rich, low and heavy impact sound and some juicy blood splattering that gets added. I can only applaud Larian here, because it requires extremely careful sound design to have everything sound so rich while still leaving room to turn it up a notch. Another great example is the sound for when a character parries an attack. There is this massive, tightly designed bass rumbling when parrying. It still catches me off guard every time, and there's absolutely no logical reason why this action should have a sound like that. And yet I absolutely love it, and I think it works great within the game. Many titles are packed with extremely rich and rewarding sounds, but all these bold, unusual choices Larian made here, and the fact that I made it work so well, is what really sets Baldur's Gate 3 apart for me. Speaking of working so well, this neatly brings me to my next point. Baldur's Gate 3's combat is turn-based. That might sound like a trivial observation, but it actually has a huge implication for sound. In real-time combat, almost anything can happen at any time. It's quite common to have multiple characters attacking each other simultaneously in quick succession. Imagine the mess it would be if every sound in Baldur's Gate 1 would be as rich and juicy as it is in Baldur's Gate 3. What a mess! Baldur's Gate 3's turn-based combat results in the fact that 2 things happening at the same time is a pretty rare occurrence. Even if the party consists of 4 players that get to do the actions in the same turn, chances are they usually won't do it all at once. This allows each sound to take center stage, as it doesn't have to compete with other actions in most cases. As mentioned in the beginning, I didn't want to just listen to some sounds and break them down. I think the examples we talked about showcase the points I wanted to get across quite well. At the same time, I'm still a bit torn though, as the game is packed with audio material that would absolutely deserve a closer look. So let's at least skip over some of them. Starting off with the detailed ambient sounds, over just how satisfying almost every event and UI element feels. I mean, listen to that successful dice roll when lockpicking something. The different Foley sounds, depending on the armor the character is wearing. And all those oh so juicy spell and skill sounds. When playing a bard, the characters basically cast their spells with the help of their instruments. Each of the 4 instruments in the game got their own sounds. And if a character doesn't have an instrument equipped, they will whistle. And it's not always the same sound, mind you. There are different sounds for different occasions. Buffs use the notes of major chords. Debuffs are very dissonant. And attacks are, as Larian sound designer Frank Munro called it, basically abusing the instrument. In general, the sheer amount of high-quality sound content this game has to offer is staggering. In the interview with A Sound Effect, it is stated that the game features over 600 actions. A good chunk of those are skills and spells, and most feature different sounds for selecting them, deselecting them, actually using them, as well as, of course, their actual effect on whatever target was chosen. Weapon skills in particular can, in turn, then have different sounds depending on the selected weapon and what was hit. Crazy! I cannot help but once again emphasize how much it speaks for both the actual sound designers as well as the management and leadership that the final product still sounds so rich and consistent. Or should I say, impactful, juicy, rich, and rewarding? Last but not least, I have to mention the music. If you ask me, composer Borislav Slavov and everyone else who worked on the soundtrack have delivered greatness here. The main theme was stuck in my head for months, so much so that my girlfriend got sick of it eventually. It only took another month or so until the walls finally broke down and she joined me whenever I started humming the melody again. While I am a musician myself, I'm happy to say that the music already got quite a bit of attention from people who are more qualified than me to talk about it, so feel free to check these out if it interests you. What I do want to point out though, is the more technical aspect of the musical implementation. Many dialogues and scenes can change their atmosphere and pacing in an instant, quite drastically. The music will always adapt for this, and not once did I notice a harsh or unfitting transition. This requires a lot of skill, care, and tight cooperation from both composers and system designers. Bravo! Now, I usually do some sort of conclusion in the end, where I summarize the video's key findings and takeaways, yada yada. But I don't think I can do it for this one. As I suspected in the beginning, this was more an appreciation post in video form. So maybe I should finish with a little appreciation summary instead. Overall, there's a lot of things to applaud Baldur's Gate 3 sound design for. But the one thing that really makes it stand out for me are the bold sound design decisions we talked about earlier. It's these that transformed a game with just great sound design into a game with a proper sound identity. But that's it for today. So, thanks and have a good one.